Are the Saints actually good at this NFL drafting, or is it not as good as you think? That's what we're going to discuss today on the Friday, April the 5th edition of the Saints Insider Podcast. I'm Zach Ewing with Rod Walker, Matthew Paris, and Jeff Duncan. Luke Johnson's not going to be here for like 3 full episodes. I want Jeff's opinion on that.
Yeah, they'll probably be the best episodes we have. I would imagine our viewership will go way up, and they'll also be more cogent.
So it's up to you all. Share this episode and next week's as well, and then we'll compare it when Luke comes back the following Wednesday and see how things go. So he's taking some well-earned vacation. We are going to answer sort of an interesting question as we continue our NFL draft series, have some historical data on the Saints and how their draft picks have produced throughout the years, went all the way back to 2002, which was Mickey Loomis' first draft. And I know Jeff's got some hot takes as usual, too. So we'll get it going. Want to let you know that this season's NFL draft coverage is brought to you by Tulane Doctors. Now at East Jefferson General Hospital, Tulane Doctors are bringing academic medicine to more patients in new communities. Look for the shield to know the future of medicine is here. Find your physician at TulaneDoctors.com or call 504-988-5000. So let's get into it. Let's get into some Saints historic draft. You know, I think for a long time, Rod, we'll start with you. For a long time, they kind of had this reputation of, they always hit on these draft picks, and they have hit on draft picks over the years. We know that. Historical, though, especially over the last 5-6 years, that has not been the case. It's been more of a mixed bag.
Yeah, no. When you talk about the Saints, you usually talk about the 06 class, of course, and then you talk about the class with Kamara, which is 2017.
Yeah.
But other than that, I mean, I think it's kind of been, like you said, a mixed bag. And, I think this is one of those years where they need to get it right. But I definitely would say, after that class, the 17 class, I think it's kind of really been hit and miss. And, I mean, there have been a few good players in there, but collectively, I don't know if the drafts have been really good after that.
Yeah, and that's kind of what started this discussion, Matt, is because this year's draft class, they've only got the 2 picks in the first 4 rounds. They've really got to hit those picks, and it would really do them a lot of good to hit on a later round pick or 2 as well.
Absolutely, and you look at where the Saints are as a franchise right now, it's different than it was obviously a few years ago. And I think when we're talking about, all right, did they miss on a pick? I kind of think the context of those seasons kind of matters, because it's, I think you can afford to take more of a risk when you're going 13-3 every year, whereas now they really have to get their foundation. They have to build back the offensive line, whereas, maybe you can be aggressive and trade up for a Marcus Davenport. It just kind of depends on where you're at as a franchise, and it hasn't gone as well for them lately, so I think they have to be a little bit more safe.
That's a great point. I mean, when they went up for Marcus Davenport, they were 13-3. They desperately needed pass rush help, and they swung for the fences on a player with obviously big upside, but it was a risk, and they whiffed on that one. So that was back also in the period when Sean Payton was extremely aggressive. I think he had a lot of say on these draft picks. They were trying to win another Super Bowl with Drew Brees, and they went for it. I think this year, and we talked about this before, since that year, whatever year it was it 18? Was the Marcus Davenport?
18.
Yeah. I think this is the most pressing need they've ever had going into a draft with tackle. Going back to that, they needed an aspect. They needed a pass rusher back then. But I think context is very important. I also think, during those early years, 17, 18, 19, they were coming off 13-3 seasons. They were drafting to the bottom of the first round. Matter of fact, I think they haven't had a top 10 pick since the early days. I mean, they haven't had a top 10 pick in this span, and they've had very few first round picks. So even the ones they've had have been near the bottom of the first round. And usually, almost every year, if you talk to draft evaluators or personnel executives, there's usually only about 20 players in every draft that have a first round grade. There's not 32 first round graded players in a draft. So lots of times at the bottom of the first round, you're getting a guy who's graded very similarly to someone at the bottom of the second round. There's not much difference in the grades between the guys in the 28, 27 range and 50. So the Saints, they've only top 15, 20 picks they've had were the year they got Penning and Olave.
They traded up to 11 to get Olave, and then I believe Marshawn Lattimore was also number 11.
Well, Lattimore was 17. I'm talking about it since then.
Yeah, I don't think since then they've had one higher than they had and they had to trade up to get Olave at 11.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So we do have to be in defense of them. They haven't been drafting up in the top 10. I don't think it's any coincidence that the two best drafts they ever had, 06 and 17, like Rod mentioned, they had a lot of picks and they had a lot of good picks. They had Reggie Bush was number 5 or number 2 in the whole draft. So in 2017 they had 2 first-round picks, and they hit on both of them in Lattimore and Ramczyk. So that's my stump to defend the personnel department.
Preemptive defense, opening argument over there. So, but you may not have known this, Dunk, but I was actually going to start with the good. We're going to start with the things the Saints have done good.
I like it.
Mickey Loomis has been basically, in control of the Saints personnel and their drafting since 2002. So that's the era we started with. That gives us 22 years of data. And in that time, the Saints have drafted 137 players. They have gotten a combined, I didn't write this down, I believe it's 63 Pro Bowl years, pretty healthy number. They've gotten a combined 299 years as primary starter. So that's an average of about, a little more than 2 per player. Okay. As far as that goes, I don't know. It's hard to say what the average is. I think we were talking about this before, Rod. Primary starter is different for the Cleveland Browns or Washington Commanders than it is for a team like the Saints or the Ravens or the Steelers, who have been successful in that time because it's harder to crack the starting lineup. So it's not 299 is on the low end in that era compared to other teams. I was poking around on Football Reference, but it's crack research.
Yeah,
but
impressed.
Yeah, it's on the low end, but I don't know that that's necessarily an indictment of the Saints either.
No, I don't think it is at all. I think that you look at this team, just what they've done. They got a Super Bowl out of it. Mm-hmm. And they've been one of the more consistent teams in the league. Throughout these last 2 years, and they've kind of struggled. And I guess you had those 3 straight, 7-9 seasons they had. But overall, this team's been pretty one of the more consistent teams in the NFL. So, if you look at it that way, I think, there's a good side. That's all the positive I got. We'll flip it over to Jeff over there.
Well,
the mouthpiece of the organization.
Early, as has been said. Let's talk about some of the best draft picks in the Mickey Loomis era. And Matt, obviously, this is before your time here, and you're the youngest here, going back maybe even before you were following the NFL.
I was born by the time Mickey Loomis.
Yes, but just barely, yeah. But you go back to a guy we've talked about with Hall of Fame discussions, Jari Evans, in that 06 draft. They got Reggie Bush that year. Jimmy Graham, Cam Jordan a little bit later, Teron Armstead. These guys were legitimately among the top 5 players at their position for years in the NFL.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. They've had a tradition of hitting on some of these mid-round picks. Jimmy Graham was a great pick. I remember. I'll tell you one that stands out to me, too. I'm probably going to write about it soon, that I think gets overlooked. This is not an impact player per se, but Thomas Morstead was a great draft pick. They traded up to take a punter, and I crushed them in my draft analysis that day, showing you what I know. So that was another good pick. They've also been very good, and I think sometimes this gets overlooked. They've been very good, especially in the Jeff Ireland era, of finding undrafted free agents. Look at Rashid Shaheed's a good example. They've been nailing return guys, and Carl Granderson is probably their best defensive lineman.
Taysom Hill was not their undrafted free agent originally, but
right.
Yeah.
They've been very good at finding undrafted free agent role players and sometimes impact players. So I think that gets overlooked. That's to them they're like draft picks. It's the same evaluation they're doing.
Is that you? You mentioned some really good players, but you didn't even mention their 7th round draft pick from 2006, Marcus Colston. Is there are people that would argue that he's the best receiver this team's ever had, and it's a legitimate argument. So they've found some gems.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And then of course, in later years, the 2017 draft class just. I know we mentioned 06 in the same breath. To me, the 17 draft class is a level of its own. If you look at what that, Marshawn Lattimore, Alvin Kamara, Ryan Ramczyk, those are the guys who are still around. But Trey Hendrickson, I'm missing somebody too who's also left.
Marcus Williams.
Alex Anzalone, Marcus Williams was the one I was thinking of. Yeah, so out of that 2017 draft class, they had 7 players, 26 years as a primary starter, 12 Pro Bowls, actually only 1 All-Pro year, oddly enough, but first team All Pro anyway. But I mean, you're talking about 12 Pro Bowls from one draft class and counting. I mean, there's legitimate possibility that Lattimore or Kamara gets another one, or Hendrickson. And so just an awesome draft class. And that's why we saw, Matt, and probably why the Saints have this reputation. Like they started winning double-digit games 4 straight years after that. They were really able to build around a draft class. Shows you what a good one can do.
Yeah, that draft class got them out of that 7 and 9 zone that they were in, and it's hard to replicate that. But it's also one of the best draft classes of all time. It might be the single best of the 2010s. You know, it was that impactful for them. I think when we talk about Mickey Loomis, you kind of have to separate it by era of, you know, after they brought Jeff Ireland in 2015, 16 is probably his first draft he had actual full impact on it. You know, it really starts to kind of change of what the Saints, I think, started to look for in players. You know, Luke's not here, but he sent me a spreadsheet of like, all right, here are the specific numbers of positions. Like, this is their size, this is their athletic score. Like, they stick to these kind of models. And, you know, because of that, it's fun to try and find the players in this year's draft who kind of match those scores. But I think because they have been so kind of hard set, that's kind of where, if we are shifting to the negatives, that's kind of where maybe they've gotten to themselves in some trouble. I think they're sticking a little bit too much by their, all right, here's what we like, here's what we look for, and sometimes they're not necessarily open to getting away from that. And I think it's gotten them into some trouble, specifically with pass rushers.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think they need to tweak that a little bit, be a little more open-minded. The way they adhere to it, especially in the early rounds, they don't want to make a mistake outside their prototypes unless it's someone with a truly redeeming quality that overshadows the prototype size that they believe in. But I do think it's smart to have some kind of model, like you say, because
and every team does.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the old Bill Walsh line: is if you start taking exceptions, you end up with a team full of exceptions. So the Saints have, I think, for the most part, they know what they want. They know what fits their schemes, and I think we've talked about this before. Is now that Clint Kubiak's here and running a different offense, how much is it going to change? I'm sure Jeff Ireland and his staff are trying to marry that up, but I think they've done a good job of finding guys, these lengthy players on defense. We know they like size, they like big guys that can run. I mean, it sounds simple, but if you look, they very rarely, they're not going to take an Antoine Winfield here, even though he's a great player. And they will say that. I mean, Jeff Ireland will say he's a great player. Patrick Queen was one I know a lot of people mocked, and he's like, he's not a good player for us. He's a great player for someone else, but not for us. That's what they believe in. And I think of late, some of those reaches have probably hurt them.
I do think their usage of, and I know he's not here anymore, but Zach Bond this year, I think it kind of opened their eyes that, okay, maybe we need to be willing to go outside the prototype a little bit. You know, they used him as a kind of an edge rusher guy, and he's not their typical guy. So I think them doing that kind of may have changed the philosophy a little bit. I mean, they're not going. They're still going to use it for especially the higher end guys in the draft.
And I want to end our discussion about their philosophy on offensive linemen, because that's clearly what, after Wednesday mock draft, we all think they're going to go offensive linemen. But let's talk for a minute. Let's go into the negative and some of the duds they've had, and not just in recent years, but you go back. Patrick Robinson in 2010 was a first-round pick. Really did not work out well. Started 1 year in the league. Looking through here, Robert Meacham in 2007, a wide receiver, first-round pick, did not work out. Jonathan Sullivan in 2003.
Oh God.
Yeah, I mean, these are first-round picks who never even really stuck as starters in the league. Is there a common thread between these guys, Dunk, as you look back?
No, I mean, that was back in the Rick Ripers era's personnel. And I think we have to make that clear. I mean, even though Mickey Loomis is the general manager, I mean, he doesn't really run the draft at all. That's one of the things I think is his strength, is he lets the head coach, he lets his personnel director, especially his college director of personnel, run the draft. I mean, Jeff Ireland, if you watch when they have a camera in the war room, Jeff Ireland's running the draft. Mickey's there. It's all a collaborative effort. I mean, Jeff Ireland's not overruling Mickey Loomis. That never happens. But Jeff Ireland's the guy drafting these people. Mm-hmm. And that was the case before, even with Rick Ripers. And I think that's a strength of Mickey Loomis, understanding that's not – I mean, Mickey Loomis came up as a salary cap evaluator. He doesn't know how to evaluate players. So he's leaning on his personnel people. And I think back then, Rick Ripers, they hit on some guys, but I don't think they were as consistent as they've been under Jeff Ireland. That's just my opinion. And some of those ones you mentioned, Patrick Robinson, I mean, he was okay. He wasn't like terrible. I mean, he played in the league for a while. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. Like I look at I think most fans would say Andres Pete was a miss. I think Andres Pete was a very good draft pick. I mean, he played and started for a long time. I mean, that
he made
to
3
me,
Pro Bowls.
Yeah, and
I mean, I know that's not the
I
end
don't
all
know if
be
he
all,
was
but-
ever really. I think he kind of overachieved there. I don't know if he was ever that good, but I do think that was like a Pete Werner is not a great player, but he's a solid starter. You know, he's not terrible. I don't think you can call that a miss. I mean, you're not going to get a home run on every pick. I mean, look around the league. I think we need perspective there too. Everyone has these kind of. I mean, the 49ers took Trey Lance and traded a bunch of picks to get him third in the draft,
And that's a model organization.
right. That's
Yeah,
what
I
I'm
mean,
saying.
yeah,
You can look around the league. The Baltimore Ravens is as well respected as they've been, even under Ozzie Newsome before, would have bad drafts. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to evaluate these players and project them a lot of times. And so the Saints have been through a little bit of a dry period. But what I was saying earlier is I think a lot of it has to do with where they're drafting. And frankly, there hasn't been a lot of great drafts of late, overall.
It's hard to be a good NFL player anyway. So, I mean, it's just, your chances of getting somebody good is just not really good, bro.
It's less than 50-50 probably on any given pick. Now, what we talk about when we talk about good picks and bad picks is really how much capital did you spend versus what kind of a player did you get. If it's a first round, you mentioned Patrick Robinson was not a terrible player, but he was not a first round. He was not worth a first round pick. On the flip side, Marcus Colston, a great player who you got in the 7th round, spent almost literally nothing. You can trade a 7th round pick for almost anything. Usually they don't hit, but when they do, man, what a bonus that is. And so that's the sort of thing. And quite frankly, the last few years, and we can talk about these last 6 drafts, 2018 to 2023, the Saints haven't done a ton of either. I mean, you look at a Cesar Ruiz or an Eric McCoy; those guys have been solid picks for where they were drafted. Some other pretty good picks last year. Jordan Howden, I think A.T. Perry showed promise as later round picks. But Matt, they haven't just hit on that star player at any point.
They haven't had a lot of capital to do so. I mean, that's
also true.
That's the thing that I think is a little bit different about these last few drafts is they're starting or they end up with 5, 6 picks rather than 7 or more than that. How much of the resources you have, what are you actually putting them toward? We mentioned the Davenport thing. I think Trevor Penning,
right.
That hasn't panned out. That's another one I think when we talk about prototypes, he really fit their prototypes, but maybe he was too raw as kind of an actual prospect of coming into the league. It just hasn't really, when you have fewer picks, the margin of error there, you've really got to nail them, and it just hasn't created that impact. That said, I think the Chris Olave trade for them really worked. You're moving up 5 spots. It really hurt the Commanders in the long run because they passed up someone like Kyle Hamilton. Could have been a much more impactful player for them, whereas, your New Orleans, you move up 5 spots. The players that Washington got out of that trade, it wasn't really, they got Sam Howell. He's now gone. Jahan Dotson, we'll see. Cole Turner's a bust. It just, if you're going to trade up, you've got to nail that, and you've got to be trading up is sometimes looked at like you're never going to win the value there. Well, I think New Orleans won the value just based on that trade.
And how do you evaluate players that they drafted that they either moved on from too quickly or traded? I think of 2 right off the top of my head. Al Woods, who had an incredible career, they drafted very late, and they moved on very quickly from him. And I think was playing in the league last year still, over 10-year career. Akeem Hicks, a guy they traded for a blocking tight end. That was an awful trade, and he ended up being a Pro Bowler. I think he might have been made All-Pro. And even Trey Hendrickson, who they elected to move on from, is clearly better than any defensive lineman they have right now. So these were hits on the personnel side, but the organization didn't take advantage of them.
Well, the first step, you have to hit the pick, and then evaluating trades later on is probably another discussion. You have to get the talent in your room. And to that end, these last 6 years, and a couple of caveats here. Number one, 2017 is a once-in-a-generation draft class. Like, you're just not going to – I don't care how well you evaluate, how lucky you get. You're just not going to do that. You need a great draft. You need great evaluation, and you need a lot of picks. And they had all that year. So it's not a totally fair comparison, but we are talking about 6 combined years. So, again, to reiterate, 2017, you had an All-Pro, 12 Pro Bowls, and 26 years as a primary starter just from that one class. The past 6 years combined – only 1 Pro Bowl. That was Eric McCoy as a fill-in this past year, and only 22 combined years as primary starter. So they just haven't gotten it done, whether it be because of injury. And the other caveat, Rod, I guess we can't – you really need 3-4 years to totally evaluate a draft class. I mean, we can't say Brian Brisset and Isaiah Foskey are busts yet. We can't even say Trevor Penning is completely a bust yet. He could still turn into a starter in this league.
I can't.
Right.
Seems less likely at this point. Chris Olave could end up being an All-Pro. He's not there yet, but he could be. So you can't – that's the other caveat here.
Right. And there's a guy, I mean, I think like Paulson Adebo, he's a guy that we don't really talk about a lot, but he's been – a really solid starter for him, and I don't know if he'll get to Pro Bowl level, but I mean, he's a guy that could possibly get to that level, I guess. But so yeah, I mean, and then you look at, and Jeff kind of mentioned this earlier, but I mean, you do have some other guys who did make All Pro that weren't drafted, and they're mostly special teams guys. But J.T. Gray, Deontay Hardy, Rashid Shaheed, all those, those guys, and so and Ramczyk. But never mind, he's in that other class. He was in the
17. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I just think. I think they've got some guys that we just have to kind of wait on.
Is there a concerning trend here? I mean, Jeff, you kind of answered this earlier. But
I got some numbers here.
Let's hear 'em.
You got all your
I
numbers.
got my numbers. You did some research too.
Yeah.
Yours is all raggedy though.
So, I know. So since 17.
Wait, can you chew some gum while you're doing this?
Yeah. Vince Lombardi, Tom Landry. They've had no top 10 picks since 17. Only 3 top 23. I cut that off because Ruiz was 24. So
cherry picking.
Only 3 in top 20. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Only 3 top 20 picks, 9 top 50, 14 top 100. So they're picking. They haven't had that many. As Matt said, they haven't had that many picks. 2019, they had no first rounder. 2020, they only had 1 pick in the top 70. So I mean, they're not leaving themselves with enough. I mean, we've talked about this being an inexact science. You have to have a bunch of bullets, to shoot at, and they haven't had that many. So I think it's a little skewed. I mean, their 3 picks they had, Brazil, Turner, and Ruiz were all 24, 28, and 29 selections. That's at the bottom of the first round, like I mentioned. They're basically getting second round level talents there. So I think it's hard to criticize them for not having Pro Bowlers when I don't know how many teams would have in that same situation.
So maybe a more valid criticism then is they're not leaving themselves enough ammo in the draft.
It's their strategy. It's the strategy they've had where they're trading away picks. They've made lots of trades, and I think overall their philosophy is they think they're right there, and they're not. I think even Eric McCoy said that this year. Maybe we're not as close as we thought we were. I think that is overall where they've miscalculated, is they think they're better than they are.
Well, that's
post Breeze, Peyton.
I think that was the problem with last year's draft is besides Brazil, like there wasn't really anyone, there wasn't logical playing time for any of those dudes. Like, Kendre Miller, I know he dealt with a lot of injuries, but is he really going to see the field outside? I know Kamara was suspended, so, maybe there was an opportunity at the beginning of the season, but Foskey was injured, but he was buried in a rotation, like a pass rush rotation anyway. Saldivari, they had offensive line problems, but he was deep down on the depth chart. There just wasn't really like great opportunities for those guys to see the field until later in the season. But it shouldn't really. It kind of always comes to that point because of injuries and such. But like if you're drafting like that, you should be looking for impact players. Like they drafted as if they were coming off a 12-5 season rather than a 7-10.
Yeah, and I think the only one I can think of, like Olave, was they needed a receiver. He stepped right in, was good right away. The one they really missed on was we talked about is Penning. I mean, they needed him to be a starter right away, and he got hurt, and then he had his chance this year and washed out after 6 games.
Yeah, even getting an average player in that spot would have been okay,
right?
And they haven't done that yet. All right, so let's answer the question, then we'll wrap things up by bringing it back to this year's draft. But go around the room, Rod. Are the Saints, let's say, great, above average, average, below average, or poor? Those 5 categories at drafting. What would you give them?
Are we including 2017 or not? Because that's going to affect my grade.
Sure. I mean, I think this regime, right? Like, is it fair since
Like
Jeff
Jeff
Ireland
Ireland
joined the team in 2016?
I'll probably give them a B minus.
Wow. Harsh.
Yeah.
Glad I wasn't in Rod's classes. He's teaching.
Yeah, I mean, 17 obviously was really, really good, but I just think when you look at as good as 17 was, I think 18 all of a sudden makes 17.
I think 18 is their worst
Yeah, when you combine 17 and 18, I mean, I think that's like
in Ireland's tenure.
a C probably. So I think they've hit on some guys. I mean, we mentioned Adebo and Olave, and so yeah, I'm gonna stick with my B minus.
Matt, I'm curious from an outsider perspective. When you came in, what was your impression of the Saints' drafting ability, personnel, and then how has it changed in the 6 months you've been here?
Yeah, I thought they were a very good drafting team. I'd lean maybe more toward I'm too close to it now where I'm like not as impressed by these guys. The 2017, like I said, and like we've all said, it is an all timer. I think that like alone boosts the grade to maybe like a B plus if you're just looking at Ireland's tenure, because you have to give them credit for hitting on those picks. Since 2017, it'd probably be closer to a C. And I think the weird thing about draft class over time is like sometimes, you have to give them 3 or 4 years, but sometimes they look worse 3 or 4 years down the road. Like obligatory Washington reference here. Looking at their 2020 draft class, it seemed like that was a really strong draft class at the time because you found Chase Young. They got Cam Curl in the 7th round. Great find. Antonio Gibson was solid for them. Well, you fast forward 4 years later, none of those guys are on the roster. 2 of them are now in New Orleans with Chase Young and Khalid Hudson, and it just hasn't, gone the way it has. So I think actually that's kind of some of what New Orleans is. Like you look at that 2019 class, maybe 20 or 21. It looked really solid at the time, and then it's kind of faded since then. So to answer your original question, I think they're average to above average overall, but lately it's been below average.
So what's the grade?
I would go B plus overall, but that's because I'm pretty much inflating 2017, which I think is an A plus.
So a B plus and a B minus.
Okay, Jeff Duncan, are the Saints good at drafting or not?
Yes, I think so. And I think I would agree with Matt, like a B plus, above average. I mean, I think you have to look at, again, incorporate the undrafted free agents that they've gotten over time. I think that counts. And I think you have to take into context, like I said, all my numbers, I don't need to bring out my wrinkly sheet again, but they haven't had a chance to draft at very many top 10 picks at all. And that's usually where you hit. I mean, just go back and look at these past drafts. 2018, 2020 drafts were historically bad drafts overall for the whole league. There's not a lot of Pro Bowlers coming out of those drafts, and they were drafting it. And so those drafts ended up being not that good for the Saints either. And then I also think you have to evaluate how the organization mishandled or misdiagnosed who they kept. Like, I think it was a huge mistake to move on from Trey Hendrickson. At the time, I thought it was bad. They should have kept him. It's clear now. They allowed Caden Ellis to leave. Caden Ellis was a good draft pick. I mean, where did they get him, in the 7th round or 6th round or something? They've kind of caused a lot of their draft problems post-draft by some of the decisions they've made. And I think overall, this philosophy of being aggressive, moving up to target a player and trading away picks, you can do that when you're good. You can be aggressive like that. They're not that team anymore, and they're still doing some of that stuff when they need to actually, I think, consider trading down and acquiring more picks and building that foundation back. That's something they need to evaluate, I think, at the highest level of the organization.
Watching the Saints Insider podcast, like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, comment, all that good stuff. Share with your friends. And want to wrap things up. We'll bring it back to this year. Our mock draft on Wednesday, we all pretty much agreed, and we have a roundtable that published on NOLA.com/Saints this morning where, again, we said Olu Fashanu, is probably the best pick the Saints could make among the players likely to be there at number 14. Jeff, you went to Elise Fuaga, although I think you agree Fashanu would be a fine pick as well.
Right.
I mean, we all agree they need a tackle. They need an offensive lineman. And it's funny, as we look at this from a historical trend, now this is pre-Jeff Ireland, but the Saints, the picks they used to hit on were offensive linemen more often than not. John Stinchcomb, Jamal Brown, Jari Evans, obviously, Teron Armstead. Even later rounds, Carl Nix had a productive career as, I think, a 4th-round pick. These were the guys that these were some of their best picks. I mean, if you looked at their top 10 picks from the first, 13, 14 years of the Mickey Loomis era, like more than half of them were offensive linemen. But now that hasn't been the case. We talked about Penning. They missed on him. Saldivari, obviously the jury's still out. Haven't drafted a lot of them really high outside of Penning.
I would say McCoy and
McCoy and Ruiz.
Yeah,
pretty
Ruiz
good.
and McCoy are good picks.
They got to get it right this year. They haven't drafted a tackle in the first round since Anders Pete, I guess.
Well,
No,
Penning.
Ramchek.
Oh, and Penning, excuse me, yeah.
And Penning. Yeah.
Was Ramchek in the first round? I guess he was right at the end of the first round. Okay, so forget I said
first.
that. They have done it, and they have hit on it okay. Does their philosophy change this year? Do they learn anything from the Penning thing? How do you guys see it?
I think the fact they're picking so high this time at 14, and this class has some really good tackles in it. Like, I almost feel like they can't miss, really. If they, you get the best tackle available, I think that's all you can ask them to do, and hope he's not Penning, and I don't think he will be.
Yeah, I mean, I keep bringing it up, and Daniel Jeremiah brought it up, so maybe I'm just parroting his point. But I think the thing that got into trouble with Penning was he was so over-aggressive in college, they thought it would translate. He wasn't ready. Fashanu, I think, is a little bit more ready to play. That's who the pick is day one. And that's the thing for me is they just need that day one starter. They need someone who isn't a project. And I think they assumed that Penning was going to be that, and he just wasn't.
Yeah, and I think I heard someone the other day say, it was Eric Galco maybe, he thinks there's 6 tackles could go in the first, 15 picks. That's crazy. And maybe top 20. So I agree with Rod. I don't think they could miss on any of these guys because they're so high, and we know these quarterbacks are going to go really high. So they're going to get their pick of probably the 2nd or 3rd best tackle in the draft. And by all accounts, these guys are all going to be solid starters. So, I think they'll be fine. And historically, you take these big men early. I mean, that's been the Saints' philosophy. I remember Mike Boss saying that. They've always believed in that there's a higher strike rate, less of a bust rate with taking offensive linemen. And it's kind of proven to be true. Even for guys like Andres Pete, they've ended up being solid draft picks.
Yeah, and there's a luck element with injuries and maybe off-field stuff. Mm-hmm. You don't always know what's going to happen with a guy, but clearly it's a good year to need a tackle. The Saints need a tackle, and boy, they really need to hit on it. So NFL Draft starts 20 days from tonight, April the 25th. We'll have a live show for you and plenty of Saints Insider between now and then. We'll be back here on Wednesday. Another NFL draft topic. I guess we got to determine what. Maybe we'll dive into some wide receivers or some edge rushers or something and talk about a couple of different positions over the next week. So until then, we appreciate you joining. Hit the like button, subscribe, keep watching, and share with your friends. For Rod Walker, Matthew Parrish, Jeff Duncan, I'm Zach Ewing, Norm Bell behind the glass. Our thanks to Tulane Doctors, and we will see you next time.